What does one do to convert to Hinduism?
Throughout its long history, Hinduism's ranks have swelled with the addition of entire tribes and other social groups that came under the influence of Hindu kingdoms. Formal conversion to Hinduism nowadays is relatively rare in India, at least among Indian nationals. Membership in the tradition's many sub-communities is far more a matter of heredity than of deliberate choice. Some non-Indians have migrated to India out of a desire to enter Hinduism formally. They typically present themselves at the temple or ashram of their choice and ask to join. And over the past several decades, small numbers of Europeans and Americans have joined. Various missionary-minded branches of the Hindu tradition, such as the Vedanta Society, with its associated monastic order, or the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. Some communities provide prospective new members basic instruction in the teachings of the group's founders and in the sacred texts. But membership does not depend on formal assent to a particular creed or system of doctrine. The one important and nearly universal ritual symbolizing conversion is the naming ceremony, or namakarana. Taking a new name, often containing a reference to the deity one chooses to worship, symbolizes the devotee's seriousness and commitment.
Are there distinctive forms of Hindu initiation?
Boys of the twice-born castes are initiated into the tradition in special ceremonies called upanayana, which mark the beginning of formal instruction in sacred learning. The initiate receives a thread and wears it draped across the shoulder as a symbol of this second birth. Women no longer receive the thread and only Brahmins nowadays wear it when not engaged in ritual ceremonies. Sacred threads are of white wool for Brahmins, of red hemp for Kshatriyas, and of yellow wool for Vaishyas. Tradition dictated that Brahmins be initiated at 7 or 8 years of age, Kshatriyas at 11, and Vaishyas at 12. But regardless of caste, most of those who still engage in the formal ceremony generally associate it with puberty.
Take away the soul and what remains?
Nothing, apparently. But the Buddha was not attempting to empty life of its meaning. He wanted people to change their minds about what matters most. Look hard at what motivates you. What can make you nearly desperate to achieve this good or avoid that evil? Look carefully, the Buddha argued, and you will see that the qualities that attract or repel you are deceptions. Probe deeply into your choices and you will see that what you are really looking for you cannot get from this possession or that person. Each being is simply what it is, and it is a serious mistake to treat your world as though it existed for you. as if what you value in each thing is its value. In a sense, the Buddha argued, all things are empty, in that they simply do not possess the soul that a grasping, craving person invests them with. Pile all your expectations onto some person or object as though you truly hope it will deliver what you want, and you are making the fundamental mistake. The notion of non-soul, anatman, is difficult to understand. But it is one of the Buddha's most provocative teachings.
What questions does the prospect of interfaith marriage raise for Hindus?
In India, with its vast Hindu majority, it is still largely taken for granted that young people will marry members of their own denomination or sect as well as of their own caste. Outside India, various external cultural pressures are changing such assumptions. Since Hindu tradition remains so intimately bound to cultural background, many traditional Hindu families would naturally prefer that their children marry other Hindus. By and large, the younger generation continues to do so.
Have there ever been schisms or heresies in Hinduism?
Toward the end of the Vedic period we find the first clear references to groups called Nastikas, those who deny or naysayers. Early Jains and Buddhists represented the most important of the non-orthodox groups that eventually developed into distinct religious traditions. Nastikas are generically distinguished from the Astikas, those who affirmed the authority of the Vedas, the existence of an indestructible soul, and the existence of God as an essential salvific power. Exponents of Brahmanic or priestly Hinduism have had a particularly large stake in combating the erosive influence of various nonconformist sectarian developments over many centuries. Some have eventually been reabsorbed into the greater Hinduism while others, such as Buddhism and Jainism, have remained distinct.
How does the Buddhist tradition describe existence in general?
Buddhist teaching focuses on three fundamental qualities of all things. Two are fairly obvious to anyone who cares to look, and are at the heart of the experience of enlightenment. The first is hardship or suffering, the second impermanence. Nobody is immune to sadness and disappointment. No one has a lock on success and genuine contentment. And everything comes to an end. Everything. The third quality is far from obvious even to the most careful observer, but an awareness of it does follow from the realities of suffering and impermanence. That is the notion that there is no permanent, indestructible core or soul at the center of any being. Hindu tradition taught Siddhartha Gautama that at the center of each individual being was a self or Atman that survived physical death to be reincarnated in another life. assuming the person died still enslaved by the effects of self-centered choices. The Buddha's reinterpretation of Hindu tradition on this point was so radical that it cuts right to the psychological bone.
How do Hindus deal ritually with death and mourning?
Hindus generally prefer cremation to burial, and most hope that their loved ones will scatter their ashes over the waters of the Ganges or one of India's many other sacred rivers. Every year many thousands of Hindu families bring the bodies of their loved ones to Benares for cremation at the burning ghats, steps, toward the downstream side of the holy city. There, or closer to home if they cannot travel easily. Led by the eldest son or an older male relative, the family completes a set of ancient rituals. They bathe and dress the body and light the pyre. The ritual leader walks 4 times to the left around the pyre and pours ghee over the body while the family chant divine names. For anywhere from 8 days to a month the family observes a period of mourning and ritual impurity. To bring that period to a close, many families arrange a ritual meal called shraddha. Relatives must minister to and nourish the dead person's spirit, lest it continue to travel abroad as a restless and potentially troublesome demon. In the case of a famous Brahmin, an extended period of mourning might last a full year. Especially holy persons, such as noted gurus, are sometimes not cremated but buried, seated upright in the lotus posture. Some sects, such as the Lingayats or Virashaivas, prefer burial for all members, possibly the result of Islamic influence. Hindus in Europe and the United States generally cremate their dead within 24 hours of death. Mourners, wearing mostly white, gather at the home for a final viewing. Family members often arrange a memorial service in the local temple to observe the death anniversary.
What are the 3 bodies of the Buddha?
The concept of the 3 bodies, Trikaya, of the Buddha evolved as a way of explaining how the spiritual entity called the Buddha nature could transcend all earthly realities and at the same time manifest itself in the world. Pure Buddha nature existed in the Dharma body and was personified as the primal or universal Buddha, living in various heavenly abodes that made up the bliss body were the 5 principal meditational Buddhas. 1 ruling the center and 4 ruling the paradises at the 4 cardinal points. Transcendent Bodhisattvas assisted the celestial Buddhas in the work of salvation through grace. Involved in earthly affairs were the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who entered history in the manifestation body, subjecting themselves to time and change out of compassion for all suffering beings.
Do Hindus have a system of religious law?
Surely the single most important Hindu religious concept is that of Dharma. As a universal notion, Dharma is the cosmic law that binds all things together. Each individual person also has his or her Dharma. The fundamental religious requirements and ethical expectations associated with each person's station in life. Classical Hindu sources also use the term Dharma in reference to countless specific moral duties and ritual rubrics. Treatises called Shastras are the principal repositories of the Hindu legal and ethical materials. They belong to the larger category of sacred literature called Smriti, remembered. Revered as of divine origin, but subordinate in authority to Shruti, heard, scriptures. The Dharma Shastras, and related texts like the Grihaya Sutras that include detailed information on every facet of householder life, derive ultimately from a text generally known as the Laws of Manu, dated variously from 600 BCE to 100 CE. The ancient law books have retained their authority well into modern times. Only recently have India's legislative bodies introduced serious and sweeping reforms. But the antiquity of tradition and inherent cultural resistance to change have kept many practices alive in spite of official attempts to adapt the classics to contemporary needs.
What other early schools and scriptures are especially important in the history of Buddhism?
A number of early Buddhist schools or denominations arose in India during the 5 or 6 centuries after the Buddha's death. One cluster, known collectively as the Hinayana, small vehicle, schools, developed as a result of differing interpretations of what manner of being the Buddha was. The most important of these schools is the Theravada. Wisdom of the Elders, the branch largely responsible for the Pali Canon. Theravada Buddhists taught that the Buddha was a historical human being who counseled others to pursue their own path to enlightenment. But some Buddhists incline toward more expansive, spiritual interpretation. The Mahasanghikas, proponents of the Great Assembly, taught that the Buddha's many previous lives as a Buddha to be a Bodhisattva. Prior to his birth as Siddhartha Gautama meant that the Buddha was more of a cosmic spiritual being than a mere mortal. All but one volume of their sizable Sanskrit, called Buddhist hybrid, scriptures have been lost. Another school, the Sarvastivadins, proponents of the view that all exists, further emphasized the importance of the Bodhisattva's spiritual evolution as a model of growth in virtue. They, too, produced a body of sacred writing. But the Sanskrit originals were lost, and we know of them through Chinese and Tibetan translations. Next to the Theravada school, the most important of the early denominations was the Mahayana, Great Vehicle. So called because of its wider appeal. Mahayana teaching emphasized the larger-than-life qualities of the Buddha. More than a mere mortal, the Buddha was a saving figure whose compassion filled the universe and whose grace was available to all who asked. Mahayana scriptures in Sanskrit included sutras claiming to be the Buddha's own words. Commentaries and treatises called shastras, and esoteric works called tantras used by smaller sects.
What does the rebirth of a non-self mean?
Buddhist tradition has devised various intricate ways of explaining this problem. One widely used image is that of a seal ring. Take a pad of warm wax and press the seal ring into it and you get a very clear impression. One that firms up as the wax cools. You've transferred something without actually leaving anything but an impression. The seal ring is something like what remains when a human being dies, still enslaved to inappropriate craving and desires. It represents the whole complex of psychic energies that make up a human personality. Energies so potent that most people are perfectly convinced of their individuality and separate personhood. In the cycle of death and rebirth, what transfers from one existence across the chasm of death into the wax of a new embodiment is precisely that incredibly powerful ego impulse. As the Buddha saw it, no one can be finally free so long as he or she clings to the notions of I, me, mine.
How did Gautama become the Buddha?
At the age of 29, tradition says, Gautama made the great renunciation of comfort and security. Borne aloft by his horse, he went over the palace walls to pursue a realistic understanding of the world and the human condition. Gautama went first to learn from two Hindu teachers, spiritual guides like those who tutor seekers in the Hindu scriptures called the Upanishads. Unsatisfied with that more philosophical approach, Gautama joined a group of ascetics in Benares. Representatives of the Jain movement perhaps, and subjected himself to several years of dire austerity. When that, too, failed, he moved on and decided to meditate alone under a tree until he achieved enlightenment. During the course of 7 weeks there, Siddhartha went through 4 trance-like stages, arriving finally at the stark realization of what Buddhist tradition calls the most basic truths of human life. Siddhartha was now worthy of the name Buddha, the enlightened one. But tradition suggests that the Buddha experienced a terrible interior struggle with the temptation to keep his newfound wisdom to himself. Mara, the demon, summoned up all his might to prevent the truths of enlightenment from spreading abroad. Overcoming all inclination to selfishness, the 35-year-old Buddha dedicated himself to teaching others the way to freedom from attachment that is the cause of all suffering. He returned to Benares, reunited with the 5 ascetics with whom he had parted company earlier, and preached the sermon called Turning the Wheel of the Law. Now the Buddha was indeed a wheel turner, but not as his father had envisioned. For the next 45 years, he would turn the greatest of all wheels, that of the Dharma. He died in Kushinagara at the age of 80, in about 463 BCE, of apparent food poisoning. Buddha on the big screen, some favorite motion pictures. Green Snake, 1993. A combination of mysticism and action based on a Chinese fable. Green Snake, Maggie Cheung, and Sun Qing, Joey Wang. Are actual reptiles who have been practicing taking human form. When self-righteous Buddhist monk Fa Hai discovers them, he thinks it's a sin to tamper with the natural order. Cantonese with English subtitles. Kundan. 1997, in 1937, in a remote area of Tibet close to the Chinese border. A 2-year-old child is identified as the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, the compassionate Buddha. He is brought to Lhasa to be schooled as a monk and as head of state. The film follows him into adulthood until his flight to India after the Chinese invasion of Tibet. Little Buddha. 1993, Tibetan Lama Norbu informs the Conrad family of Seattle that their 10-year-old son Jesse may be the reincarnation of a respected monk. Stars Keanu Reeves. 7 years in Tibet. 1997, Heinrich Harrer, Brad Pitt, travels to the Himalayas on a mountain climbing trip. War breaks out and he is placed in a prisoner of war camp. He escapes to Tibet where he befriends the young Dalai Lama and witnesses the escalation of the conflict between Tibet and China. Temptation of a monk. 1994, costume drama about China's 7th century Tang dynasty. General Shi, Wu Xianguo, is duped into an assassination plot against the crown prince. After a massacre, the general flees and finds sanctuary with a group of Buddhist monks at a remote temple. Why has Bodhidharma left for the East? 1989. Set in a remote monastery in the Korean mountains, the film follows an old master, close to death, who must lead his disciples in their search for spiritual freedom. Korean with English subtitles.
Have Hindus traditionally sent out missionaries to convert others?
Hinduism has generally not produced the kind of missionary activity characteristic of traditions like Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. Significant traces of Hindu tradition and culture are very much in evidence all over Southeast Asia, especially in parts of Indonesia. Throughout late antiquity, 4th through 8th centuries, and the Middle Ages. 9th through 15th centuries, important Hindu dynasties ruled portions of present-day Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Major archaeological research attests to their splendor and power. But their trappings of Hindu symbol and ritual were less a matter of missionary zeal than of a desire to cloak themselves with the prestige of the great Indian dynasties. In addition, they sought to enhance their political legitimacy through the concept of divine kingship by identifying their monarchs as descendants of the gods. In modern times, however, a number of missionary organizations have grown from Hindu roots. In addition to the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, Vivekananda's 1863 to 1902, Ramakrishna Mission has made important contributions in this regard. Although its gains have been modest in terms of numbers, the mission's members have become known for various kinds of social outreach as well as for offering lectures and spiritual guidance. In many major United States cities, branches of an organization called the Vedanta Society appeal to a well-educated public by emphasizing the traditional way of knowledge, rather than the way of devotion preferred by both Vivekananda and his teacher Ramakrishna, 1834-86.
Who are the Shaivites?
At least 6 sub-denominations make up Shaiva Hinduism. As with Vaishnavism, their views on the nature of the divine-human relationship set them apart. A major sect in South and Southeast Indian region called Tamil Nadu is known as Shaiva Siddhanta, truth about Shiva. Tracing its roots to Rishi Termular, c. 200 CE, the group's central teaching is a blend of theism and monism. Individual souls seek God, and devotees and worshippers in this life and ultimately will merge totally with Shiva. Pashupata Shaivism, founded by Lakolasha, c. 200, and popular in far northeast, north, and western central India, holds a variation on that teaching. Souls finally merge with God but maintain individuality somewhat. As stars are lost as discrete bodies in the infinite night sky. Also found in the northern state of Kashmir is a distinctive Shaiva sect founded by Vasugupta, c. 800 CE. The Kashmiri school is monistic, teaching the complete and perfect oneness of all reality in Shiva. A major sect in northeast India is called Siddha Siddhanta, with roots in the teaching or Rishi Gorakshanatha. c. 950 CE. Blending theism and monism. This school says all individual things are eventually reabsorbed into Shiva as bubbles arise in water. A minor group still influential in southern India is called Shiva Advaita. Its first teacher, Shrikanta, c. 1050. Preferred a qualified theism in which the worshipper participates in divinity without losing identity. Finally, a major sect in southwest Indian is known as Virashaivism. Members are sometimes referred to as Lingayats because many carry with them in a small case a miniature Shiva Linga. A major poet called Basavana, 1105-67, remains an influential source of the sect's teaching of qualified theism, according to which God is like the sun, souls its rays.
Are Hare Krishnas Hindus?
Members of an organization known officially as the International Society for Krishna Consciousness are Vaishnavites and devotees of Krishna and his consort Radha. They are followers of the teaching of the Bengali saint Chaitanya. A former pharmaceutical salesman named A.C. Bhaktivedanta 1896 to 1977, was initiated by a Vaishnava guru and eventually became a sannyasi in 1959. He founded the organization in 1965 in the United States, establishing a number of temples. Membership includes both married householders and celibate. Members of monastic communities attached to the temples. Bhaktivedanta instilled in the organization a sense of missionary zeal, and in 1970 decided to take the movement back to India. There he established denominational temples in Vrindavan and Mayapur, the birthplaces of Krishna and Chaitanya respectively. ISKCON maintains a number of temples across North America, some supporting themselves through vegetarian restaurants attached to them. Devotees in the United States came to be popularly known as the Hare Krishna people because they often gathered in public to celebrate their joyous praise of God by chanting Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Hare Rama, Hare Hare.
Is there a central teaching authority for Hindus?
Since Hindu tradition is a complex of many denominations and sub-traditions, there is no central institutional structure that functions as a central teaching authority. Many of the individual denominations and sects maintain systems of checks on the integrity of the tradition in the form of teaching lineages. Instruction has historically been based on oral transmission of the basic sources, along with extensive commentary, both oral and written, on those sources. Perhaps the closest thing to centralized authority is the living master to whom disciples give their uncontested allegiance. That living master embodies both the authority of an unbroken succession of teachers and his or her personal authority as one spiritually connected to the ancient well springs of wisdom. Even the Vedas and the associated primary sacred texts grouped under the heading of Shruti, heard, do not claim the universal adherence of all Hindus.
How do Hindus ritualize marriage?
Traditional Hindu families continue the ancient practice of arranged marriage and generally do not countenance the kind of dating practices prevalent among non-Hindus in the United States. Marriage within one's caste remains a major concern for most Hindus, whether within India or abroad. An extended period of betrothal usually follows the initial arrangements between the families, and includes the exchange of gifts and chaperoned meetings of the betrothed. Ceremonies typically occur in the early evening, after sunset, in a venue chosen by the families. In the temple, the home, or at a local hotel. One or more priests preside over the ceremony, reciting set ritual texts from the scriptures. In India, one priest often appears as a representative for each family. Astrological consultation still often determines the specific auspicious timing of the ceremony. Wedding ceremonies begin with the family of the bride symbolically giving away their daughter. After the community greets the new couple, the officiant chants special prayers while the bride and groom sit before a fire holding hands. Concluding the formal ritual, the bride and groom express consent by taking the 7 steps symbolizing energy, vitality, success, happiness, wealth. Traditionally measured in livestock, auspicious turning of the seasons, and friendship. Extended receptions generally follow the ceremonies.
What were the 4 passing sites?
On several occasions the young Gautama had to leave the confines of the palace. Although his father instructed his servants to clear the road of any unsightly reminders of human frailty, Gautama would nevertheless find himself asking the hardest questions of all. On one excursion, he saw someone bent and struggling to walk. Old age, his servants explained, a hardship many people must eventually face. Another time, Gautama spotted a leper lying by the way in pain. That was illness, his servants explained, it happened to many people. Then one day Gautama's entourage came across a funeral procession. Death, said his servants, and no one escapes that. Finally, according to the traditional account, Gautama saw by the road a young man who obviously possessed nothing and yet seemed content. That was the world renouncer Shuddhodana so badly wanted his son not to become. The traditional account holds that all of the 4 experiences resulted from divine intervention. The gods assuming the roles of suffering human beings so that Gautama would be moved to take the next critical steps in ensuring the possibility of enlightenment for humankind. The clearly formulaic account admirably sums up the key issues that would eventually provide the foundations of Gautama's enlightenment and Buddhahood.
Who are the main Hindu religious officials or specialists?
Traditional Hindu vocabulary includes dozens of technical terms to designate virtually every imaginable variety of religious function or specialized qualification. Essential to every Hindu temple is its priestly staff. Larger temples often have many priests, sometimes called pujaris, those who engage in the daily worship called puja on the staff, one of whom generally serves as chief or senior priest. People generally address priests as Shri, the equivalent of reverend. Frequently but not exclusively of the Brahmin caste nowadays, temple priests marry and have families. At temples that have become important pilgrimage centers, specialists called pandas serve as pilgrim guides and keep records of the families who make up the regular membership of the temple. Ritual specialists called purohitas, those who lead, are generally Brahmins of the Smarta denominations who do mostly home ceremonies for Brahmin families. Gurus, who are generally learned Brahmins, still almost exclusively perform the various samskaras, or rites of passage, and tutor upper caste children in the ancient traditions.
How do Hindus view Hinduism's relationships to other traditions?
For many centuries the greater Hindu tradition has shown enormous flexibility in adapting to religious pluralism. It came to be the greater Hinduism, in part at least, because of that quality of expansiveness. Many Hindus regard their religious heritage as a kind of spiritual umbrella capable of sheltering all who seek refuge beneath it. Historically, different denominations have drawn once separate traditions into their embrace. For example, Vaishnavite tradition came to incorporate Buddhism by installing the Buddha as the ninth of Vishnu's 10 avatars, a hospitable gesture, perhaps, but one that Buddhists do not recognize. Some Hindus have suggested that Jesus and other foundational figures also find a place in the greater Hindu scheme of things. A major early modern movement that began as an attempt to soften the animosity between Hindus and Muslims in northwestern India especially is now known as Sikhism. The Sikh community has become largely identified with a region called the Punjab, which straddles the India-Pakistan border. Sikh separatists have continued to assert their desire for a homeland.
Do Buddhists believe in an afterlife?
Although the Buddha himself emphasized the need to focus on this worldly concerns, his followers soon developed a complex understanding of the spiritual structure of the universe. According to both Theravada and Mahayana models, all of reality is divided into three realms. The realm of desire, Kamadhatu, encompasses everything from innumerable hells through the dwelling places of animals, humans, lesser gods, and the various paradises in which good people can expect to enjoy the fruits of a good life. Each level of hell is suited to a particular kind of selfishness and evil. The heavens are similarly graded for the enjoyment of the just. A certain sexist attitude is built into the notion of paradise, since in order to gain entry into the highest heaven women must first be reborn as men. Those reborn into the next major level up, the realm of form, Rupadhatu, leave behind the senses of taste, touch, and smell. Through hearing, sight, and mental impressions they continue the ongoing process of spiritual refinement and education. Denizens of this realm's multiple heavens, from 16 to 18, progress upward through various stages of contemplative discipline, arriving finally at the third cosmic realm, that of non-form, Arupadhatu. Dispensing with sight and hearing, dwellers in this realm progress through four aditonal heavens through meditation, arriving at last at nirvana. Beyond that, according to some Mahayana schools, lie several Buddha fields. Transcendent Buddhas, such as Amitabha, in China. Amida in Japan, reign over their individual Buddha fields. Amitabha is the Western paradise called the Pure Land. Popular belief suggests that devotees can bypass the lower intermediate steps and progress directly to this final abode merely by expressing perfect faith in the transcendent Buddha.
Could you sum up the Buddha's classical teaching on how a good life might unfold?
Any person who wishes to make sense of life must begin by hearing the Dharma. Seeking to understand the teaching of the utterly trustworthy Buddha. Translating the teaching into action means abiding by the fundamental recommendations and rules of conduct for living a moral life. Moving a step beyond the ethical minimum requires a person to seek greater personal discipline by guarding the senses and doing whatever is necessary to avoid the subtle corrosion of evil influences. That in turn inevitably leads to a higher level of mindfulness and awareness of each moment. This may seem at first to suggest a bland, even incredibly boring, life. But Buddhist tradition insists, paradoxically perhaps, that this alone can offer genuine appreciation and enjoyment, true bliss. Only such enlarged awareness is really worth the name living. For everything else is life on autopilot, a sure recipe for stress and frustration. At some point the seeker will need to pursue serious training in meditation. Meditative discipline aims immediately to help the seeker identify and neutralize sources of anxiety and uncertainty. A kind of spiritual map for serious seekers is called the 12-spoked wheel of conditioned arising. It describes in schematic fashion the cycle by which ignorance gives rise to intent to act, which in turn gives rise to consciousness, awareness of name and body, capacity for sense contact. Actual contact, sensation, craving, grasping, becoming, birth, old age, and death. The seeker must in effect work backward through the chain of conditions to eliminate the ignorance at the root. Those who persevere along this path hope to arrive at a genuinely contemplative approach to life and ultimately, at spiritual liberation. This classical teaching clearly lays out a difficult and demanding path. Relatively few are able to follow it consistently. That is one of the reasons that more popular forms of Buddhist devotion and practice have had a broader appeal.
How do Hindus feel when one of their members decides to leave the faith?
Membership in most smaller local Hindu communities across India is so intimately linked with a larger network of social and economic factors that the notion of leaving the faith is virtually meaningless. To live in the community is to be a Hindu. In the big cosmopolitan cities like Bombay, Calcutta, and Delhi, the matter is naturally more complex. Social relations are undergoing a higher rate of change in some places. but even there most people who think of themselves as Hindu will likely continue to do so. Whether or not they participate regularly in traditional religious observances. When individuals make a conscious effort to forsake the tradition altogether because they find that it no longer meets their needs, their families experience a sense of loss. One fewer member of the clan participates in the family's observance of the sacred occasions that have offered a sense of togetherness and joy. Individuals who drift away from traditional practice often continue to call themselves Hindu as a cultural identifier. And among immigrant families in the United States, for example, a surprising number of younger adults find themselves going in the opposite direction. Many feel a desire to return to the tradition because of an interest in their cultural roots.
What are the Four Noble Truths?
Enlightenment means grasping the fundamental realities. Summed up in Buddhism's Four Noble Truths, life is difficult. All hardship and suffering comes from inappropriate attachment or grasping. To avoid suffering, avoid inappropriate craving. To stop inappropriate craving, follow the Eightfold Noble Path.
What is the practice known as sati?
The word sati originally referred to a woman of virtue. A reference to a newly widowed individual who joined her husband in death by throwing herself on his funeral pyre. The name comes from Shiva's wife Sati, who committed suicide after her father insulted her new husband. Ritual suicide by widows spread through medieval times and continued well into the early modern era. Even after the practice was outlawed in 1829, it continued in many villages. Incidents of sati still occasionally make headlines. But increasing social action on behalf of women's rights continues to improve the situation all over India.
Do Buddhists believe in miracles?
Popular lore about the Buddha and numerous other holy personages is bursting with accounts of miracles. Buddhist tradition attributes far more miraculous deeds to the Buddha than almost any other tradition ascribes to a foundational figure. Scores of wonders occur at the moment of the Buddha's birth. All portents of the event's cosmic significance. Lamps all across the world lit themselves at that moment, the mute sang. The lame danced, and birds were suspended in their flight. The Buddha is said to have performed dozens of fabulous feats throughout his lifetime. Traveling great distances instantly, ascending into the air, subduing wild animals, and walking on water. Several of the wonders have become part of a canonical list of 8 great events, each associated with one of the cardinal or intermediate directions. Hard-headed realist that he was, the Buddha does not appear to have claimed miraculous powers of any sort. But within a short time of his death, tales of his superhuman powers multiplied. Important tales include 547 Jatakas, stories of the Buddha's previous lives as the Buddha to be incarnated in myriad different forms. The Bodhisattva performs countless marvels on behalf of all suffering beings. Many other important Buddhist leaders have enjoyed similar notoriety. Founders of lineages, denominations, and monasteries from Tibet to Japan are said to have performed deeds like those attributed to the Buddha himself.
Are there mythic elements in Buddhist tradition?
Mythic expression plays a far less central role in Buddhist teaching than in Hinduism. In fact, you might say one of the Buddha's main concerns was to demythologize Hindu tradition as he had received it. Hindu myth introduces believers to the impenetrable mystery of the divine while attempting to describe how the divine presence infuses the world of human experience. The Buddha cautioned against taking refuge in myth. However potent the divine presence may be, it does not relieve human beings of ultimate responsibility for their own choices. As in so many religious traditions, the foundational figure himself soon became the focal point of a new mythology. Even the most hardcore Theravada tradition leaves room for the Buddha to expand into a being of supramundane qualities. Wondrous tales of the Buddha's previous lives, the Jatakas, radiate mythic energy. Some of the Mahayana denominations and sects, those of the widely popular Pure Land variety in particular, evolved their own complex descriptions of a multi-level cosmos, ruled by multiple Buddhas and populated by countless lesser spiritual powers as well. Vajrayana Buddhism, represented especially by various Tibetan lineages, retained much of ancient Hinduism's mythic spirit and cast of characters. But the Tibetans interiorized the myth, interpreting the many spiritual beings as projections of the inner powers with which one identifies through meditative practice. Even in popular Mahayana and the more esoteric Vajrayana teachings, mythic elements never attain quite the centrality they enjoy in Hindu tradition.
What were the earliest Buddhist sacred texts?
For several centuries the Buddhist community preserved the treasure of the Buddha's teachings orally. Monks and devout laypersons memorized increasingly formulaic versions of what the Buddha had said and the way he had behaved. As the community of monks became more stable, settling for longer periods in fixed residences, the practice of communal recitation of the sacred words became the primary mechanism for maintaining the teachings intact. Any error in recitation could be corrected immediately to ensure uniformity and It was believed, perfect accuracy. Local communities recited the text in their own vernaculars, since no one sacred language had been decreed. Earliest texts were organized into three major groupings or baskets, Pitaka. 1. Called the Vinaya Pitaka, contained all the rules of monastic discipline. Another gathered the Buddha's speeches, the Sutra Pitaka, and a third, much later. Text included 7 lengthy theoretical interpretations of the Buddha's teaching, the Abhidharma Pitaka. At a gathering called the Third Council in 250 BCE, members agreed on the first official formulation of all three baskets as a single scripture called the Tripitaka in a northeastern Indian language called Pali. Monks continued to keep the texts alive almost exclusively through memory for perhaps another century or so. Finally, the sacred texts were systematically committed to writing and became the basis of what is now known as the Pali Canon.
How and where do members of local Hindu communities come together?
Local and regional temples are the major gathering places. Hindus use religiously and socially and support financially. Individual temples in India are generally dedicated predominantly to a particular deity. Most center around some aspect or manifestation of Shiva or Vishnu, or one of their major female consorts or counterparts. A temple will typically also have subordinate shrines dedicated to other names and forms of the central deity. Some smaller local temples may also belong exclusively to sex-worshipping deities largely unknown outside the area. Most temples draw sectarian client. In many regions outside India, however, greater diversity in the makeup of local communities often requires greater flexibility in the religious orientation of temples. For example, Indian immigrants around American cities such as Pittsburgh and St. Louis come from various places in India and represent a variety of sectarian backgrounds. As a result, the temples that serve the regions are sensitive to a wider spectrum of devotional needs than might be the case at a local temple in an area where Hindus are in the majority and where one sect predominates. Large temples in both Pittsburgh and St. Louis have been funded by Indian populations largely of immigrants from South India. Both temples are therefore dedicated to a popular South Indian manifestation of Vishnu called Sri Venkateshvara, Lord of the Sin-Forgiving Hill. But in order to serve the diverse local population, both temples include prominent devotional symbolism familiar both to Shaivites and to Vaishnavites.
Does millennialism have a place in Buddhist thinking?
Buddhist interpretations of history, like those of Hindu tradition generally, are relatively unconcerned with notions like beginnings, progress, and endings. Time is so much grander than any human mind can fathom. Unimaginably large cycles give way to more of the same. But just as Hindu explanations of cosmic cycles can include a sense of expectation, so Buddhist tradition also makes room for a kind of Adventist thinking. Buddhists call the spiritual person or power whose future coming holds hope for all believers Maitreya, the benevolent one. 5,000 years after the death of this age's historical Buddha, the one originally called Siddhartha Gautama, Maitreya will enter the world of time and change. At present Maitreya lives as a bodhisattva in the heaven called Tushita. Contented ones, the celestial realm reserved for future Buddhas. Both Theravada and Mahayana traditions give Maitreya an important role. But devotion to this bodhisattva is much more developed in several Mahayana denominations. Classical Chinese teachings regarded Maitreya as a savior figure. But the cult of Amitabha gradually displaced that of Maitreya. Tibetan tradition holds that Maitreya will arrive in 30,000 years to teach all people. This bodhisattva has a long history of popular devotion in Korea and Japan under the name Myruck or Moroku. Colossal statues of Myruck stand on Korean hillsides and in temple compounds, some visible for several miles. And in Japan, Kyoto's ancient Kyryuji temple enshrines an exquisite 6th century statue of Moroku. Gazing down on all who enter, the beautiful and very feminine-looking Moroku radiates compassion. Moving from the sublime to the deliberately ridiculous. A comical figure called Milo in China and Hodai in Japan represents another facet of Maitreya altogether. Hodai is depicted as a fat, jovial, scantily clad character. He is actually a Chinese Zen monk named Putai who claimed to be a manifestation of Maitreya.
When and where did Buddhism begin?
Buddhism began in a region of northeast India, part of which is present-day Nepal. During the mid-6th century BCE the kingdom of Koshala ruled the area from its capital city of Shravasthi, also known as Kapilavastu. One of the realm's leading factions was the Shakya clan. Traditionally identified as belonging to the Kshatriya or warrior caste. India at that time was politically fragmented into well over a dozen major regional powers. The vast majority of the population practiced forms of Hindu tradition under the leadership of a strong Brahmin priesthood. Ritual and belief centered largely on this worldly concerns, such as managing weather to ensure good harvest and curing illness. But some who had inherited the ancient tradition were beginning to question its efficacy. The famed holy city of Benares was part of the Koshala realm. There and elsewhere in the kingdom individuals and small groups of religious seekers raised issues about possible life after death, including the notion of rebirth into other modes of existence. Within the Hindu tradition the new questioning gave rise to the scriptures called the Upanishads. With their deep reflection on the nature of the self and of greater spiritual realities, Some of these new seekers parted company with mainstream Hindu tradition altogether, and eventually developed into whole new communities of belief and practice. One such community is now called the Jain tradition, named after the Jinas or spiritual conquerors to whom tradition attributes its founding spirit. The demanding ascetic discipline taught by Jainism's Tirthankaras, those who find crossing places in the river, formed one of the religious options available as early Buddhism developed. Buddhism itself would join Jainism as one of a number of splinter groups that, from a Hindu perspective, were unacceptable. These heretics got the name Nastika. Those who deny the fundamentals of Hindu belief as it was evolving then. What we now call Buddhism thus grew out of an age of political and spiritual ferment, offering seekers one of a number of significant religious options.
Who was Buddha?
According to legend, the Buddha was a strikingly handsome man. One very respected Brahmin leader, Kanki, said of him, "The recluse Gautama is lovely. Good to look upon, charming, possessed of the greatest beauty of complexion, of sublime color, a perfect stature, noble of presence." For many years Buddha's followers refused to paint the Buddha in a human form. They believed that he had moved on to a place greater than their human domain. Later, however, they began to see him and depict him as possessing the 32 bodily characteristics of a Mahapurusha, great person.
Is there a distinctively Buddhist ethic?
Compassion for all sentient beings is the overriding principle in Buddhist ethics. It was compassion, karuna, that urged the Buddha to share his message of enlightenment. Life's greatest challenge is to act out of genuine altruism. To be and do for others without hoping for reward. Compassion needs to be doubly disciplined. One needs to work toward the alleviation of suffering purely because that is humanity's highest calling. But it is also essential to know how best to put compassion into action. That calls for the practical wisdom that comes from a keen awareness of one's own spiritual history, including a recollection of one's previous lives. The ability to recall one's former existences is a mark of genuine enlightenment and a sign of profound awareness. Buddhist ethics combine the compassion of one who appreciates the pervasiveness of suffering with the practical wisdom that comes from a detailed experiential knowledge of what works. The result is a virtue called skill in means, upaya. In other words, it is the motive for behaving ethically compassion. The framework within which to choose a course of action wisdom, and the resources with which to act.
What do Buddhists believe about ultimate spiritual reality or God?
One of the many issues the Buddha refused to speculate on was the existence or significance of gods. As a Hindu, he naturally learned the traditional stories of the divinities. As a man of his time, with all its religious and intellectual ferment, the Buddha questioned the wisdom of reliance on ritual sacrifice. He did not deny the existence of the gods. He merely insisted that whatever power the gods might possess, it could not solve the fundamental human dilemma. That remained the sole responsibility of the individual person. Many Buddhist sacred texts talk of the gods in mythic terms. It was, for example, the gods who made sure young Siddhartha Gautama encountered the 4 passing sights that turned his life around. But classical Buddhist teaching does not refer to an ultimate reality in personal terms. That changed as popular devotional forms of Buddhism developed, especially in China, Korea, and Japan. Buddha himself assumed virtually divine proportions, and the concept of the universal Buddha nature superseded that of the Buddha as historical human teacher. Gods of ancient Hindu myth retained a place in the Buddhist spiritual cosmos but remained very much in the background.
Was Buddhism ever identified with any political regimes?
Buddhism enjoyed the patronage of 2 very influential Indian monarchs. A ruler of the Maurya dynasty named Ashoka, r. 270 to 230 BCE, is credited with for the first dramatic expansion of Buddhism across much of India. He declared Buddhism the state creed and sent missionaries westward through present-day Afghanistan and south to Sri Lanka. Not until nearly 4 centuries later did Buddhism again profit from formal political support. A king of the Kushan dynasty named Kanishka, r. 120 to 162 CE, picked up where Ashoka had left off. In fact, Kanishka may have learned of Buddhism in his native land to the northwest of India as a result of Ashoka's earlier missionary endeavors. Kanishka launched a new wave of missionary activity, dispatching monks to China, Tibet, and Burma. But it was the newer Mahayana teaching that Kanishka supported. Only one other important Indian regime would give Buddhism the official seal of approval. From its capital in Bengal to the northeast, the Pala dynasty, 750-1150, supported a brand of Mahayana teaching that retained esoteric elements from Hinduism. Before the last of the Palas died, Buddhism would be nearly defunct in India. Outside of India, several Buddhist dynasties helped to establish the tradition in Southeast Asia. On Indonesia's central island, Java, the Shalandras, 778 to 864, professed a type of Mahayana teaching. Meanwhile, Buddhist monarchs helped the tradition take root in Tibet.
Who was the Buddha and what does tradition say about his early life?
According to widely accepted tradition, a child called Siddhartha. He who has achieved his goal, Gautama, was born around 563 BCE. Recent scholarship has begun to offer various views as to the chronology of the Buddha's life. But this text will retain the more traditional account, since it conveys an important sense of the feel of Buddhist lore. Siddhartha's father, Shuddhodana, was a wealthy member of the ruling elite, a prince of sorts. When the child was born, his father consulted religious specialists to see what portents the boy's body might communicate. They told him the child was destined to become either a world renouncer or a wheel turner, Chakravartin. An expression roughly equivalent to mover and shaker and sometimes extended to mean king of all India. Shuddhodana resolved that his son would take the path of power and influence. So he contrived to shelter the boy from any experience that might incline him another way. Gautama lived a life of ease and pleasure in his father's palace. Surrounded by wealth and beauty and the trappings of authority, he married at 16 and had a son. As it turned out, Gautama's father failed to insulate his son from contact with the harsher side of life. Eventually Gautama would leave the palace, as well as his own wife and child, and seek his own path. The traditional story is clearly meant to underscore certain dramatic elements in the Buddha's spiritual development. His son, Rahula, reappears later in the story as one of the early monks, and his wife is said to have become one of the first nuns.
Are there any signs or symbols that might identify an individual as a Buddhist?
In most parts of the world in which Buddhism remains an important presence, it is a safe bet that many people on the street have had some direct contact with Buddhist tradition. But it is usually difficult to tell Buddhists from non-Buddhists merely by looking at their clothing or other personal effects. Occasionally you will spot an item of jewelry whose symbolism is more or less explicitly Buddhist. The eight-spoked wheel of Dharma is a common symbol easily reproduced on small-scale items. Buddhist pilgrims, however, often stand out because of the traditional garb and variety of symbols they wear. In Japan, for example, some pilgrims wear a large, round, pointed, or bowl-like straw hat, carry pilgrim staffs, and wear around their necks a small cloth wallet, in which to collect the souvenir stamps they receive from each temple they visit. Monks, nuns, and priests are surely the most obvious examples here of distinctive signs. Nearly everywhere in the world, monks and nuns shave their heads. They typically wear a distinctive habit or garb, consisting of 2 or 3 wraps, 2 for novices, 3 for senior monks and nuns. One wrap covers the lower body, another the upper. For religious rituals, monks wear a long cloth of 12 folds, sometimes called the stole, over the left shoulder. Colors vary according to region and institutional affiliation. From one branch of the monastic order or Buddhist lineage to another. Saffron is the most common color for monastic garb, but, for example, Tibetan monks often wear a dark burgundy, Japanese monks typically don darker shades of gray, brown, and violet, and Chinese nuns often wear a simple gray robe.
Are there any signs or symbols that might identify an individual as a Buddhist?
In most parts of the world in which Buddhism remains an important presence, it is a safe bet that many people on the street have had some direct contact with Buddhist tradition. But it is usually difficult to tell Buddhists from non-Buddhists merely by looking at their clothing or other personal effects. Occasionally you will spot an item of jewelry whose symbolism is more or less explicitly Buddhist. The eight-spoked wheel of Dharma is a common symbol easily reproduced on small-scale items. Buddhist pilgrims, however, often stand out because of the traditional garb and variety of symbols they wear. In Japan, for example, some pilgrims wear a large, round, pointed, or bowl-like straw hat, carry pilgrim staffs, and wear around their necks a small cloth wallet, in which to collect the souvenir stamps they receive from each temple they visit. Monks, nuns, and priests are surely the most obvious examples here of distinctive signs. Nearly everywhere in the world, monks and nuns shave their heads. They typically wear a distinctive habit or garb, consisting of 2 or 3 wraps, 2 for novices, 3 for senior monks and nuns. One wrap covers the lower body, another the upper. For religious rituals, monks wear a long cloth of 12 folds, sometimes called the stole, over the left shoulder. Colors vary according to region and institutional affiliation. From one branch of the monastic order or Buddhist lineage to another. Saffron is the most common color for monastic garb, but, for example, Tibetan monks often wear a dark burgundy, Japanese monks typically don darker shades of gray, brown, and violet, and Chinese nuns often wear a simple gray robe.
What signs or symbols distinguish Buddhist ritual specialists?
Priests who officiate in Buddhist temples that serve the public wear a variety of colors and use various implements. Priests often wear a special robe called a kashaya, kesa in Japan. The vestment is unusual in that it is typically a patchwork of many colors and textures, recalling the simplicity and poverty of the Buddha's earliest disciples. An abbreviated form of the kesa is the waijisa, a simple swatch of cloth worn over the shoulders. Some monastic priests in Japan carry a staff called a shakujo. 6 metal rings near the top make a jangling sound, alerting small defenseless creatures to remove themselves from harm's way. The Bodhisattva Jizo, usually dressed as a monk or priest, typically carries the staff. Within private or monastic settings, ritual specialists have an even greater diversity of signs and symbols. since their rituals are often more esoteric and complex. Tibetan monks, for example, don very colorful headgear distinctive of their various lineages for special rituals. Tibetans and members of other esoteric sects also use a wider variety of special ritual objects than are used in popular denominations.
What signs or symbols distinguish Buddhist ritual specialists?
Priests who officiate in Buddhist temples that serve the public wear a variety of colors and use various implements. Priests often wear a special robe called a kashaya, kesa in Japan. The vestment is unusual in that it is typically a patchwork of many colors and textures, recalling the simplicity and poverty of the Buddha's earliest disciples. An abbreviated form of the kesa is the waijisa, a simple swatch of cloth worn over the shoulders. Some monastic priests in Japan carry a staff called a shakujo. 6 metal rings near the top make a jangling sound, alerting small defenseless creatures to remove themselves from harm's way. The Bodhisattva Jizo, usually dressed as a monk or priest, typically carries the staff. Within private or monastic settings, ritual specialists have an even greater diversity of signs and symbols. Since their rituals are often more esoteric and complex. Tibetan monks, for example, don very colorful headgear distinctive of their various lineages for special rituals. Tibetans and members of other esoteric sects also use a wider variety of special ritual objects than are used in popular denominations.